The cameras were rolling, the audience was cheering, and then 15-year-old Isabella Santos stood at the Family Feud podium, fighting against the overwhelming drowsiness that could strike without warning at any moment, her eyelids heavy, not from boredom or tiredness, but from a neurological condition that made her brain unable to properly regulate sleep and wakefulness. When Steve Harvey asked about times when you're completely misunderstood, Isabella's response, delivered while struggling to maintain the alertness that most people take for granted, would reveal what it means to live with narcolepsy in a world that assumes falling asleep during important moments is a choice rather than a symptom of a serious medical condition. "When I fall asleep in the middle of class and everyone thinks I'm lazy or don't care," Isabella had said, her words slightly slurred by the constant battle against sleep that defined every moment of her waking life. "But I have narcolepsy and my brain can't control when I sleep. I could fall asleep right now and there's nothing I can do to stop it." The studio had fallen into an uncomfortable silence as everyone present began to understand that they were witnessing someone whose brain was fundamentally different from theirs, whose struggle to stay awake was not a matter of willpower or motivation, but a neurological condition that could overwhelm her consciousness at any moment, regardless of how important or inappropriate the timing might be. Isabella Santos had been living with narcolepsy with cataplexy since age 12. When what had initially seemed like typical teenage fatigue and moodiness had revealed itself to be a serious neurological disorder that affected her brain's ability to regulate sleep-wake cycles. The condition had transformed her from an active social middle schooler into someone who lived in constant fear of falling asleep during conversations, tests, meals, or any other activity that required sustained consciousness and attention. Narcolepsy is a chronic neurological disorder that affects the brain's ability to control sleep-wake cycles. People with narcolepsy experience overwhelming daytime drowsiness and sudden attacks of sleep that can occur at any time, regardless of how much sleep they have had or how inappropriate the timing might be. Isabella's condition also included cataplexy, a symptom that caused sudden muscle weakness or paralysis triggered by strong emotions like laughter, surprise, or excitement. The most devastating aspect of Isabella's narcolepsy was its unpredictability and the way it interfered with every aspect of normal teenage life. She could be engaged in conversation, taking a test, eating lunch, or participating in any other routine activity when a sleep attack would suddenly overwhelm her consciousness, causing her to fall asleep for anywhere from a few minutes to several hours without any ability to resist or control the onset of sleep. The cataplexy episodes that accompanied Isabella's narcolepsy were equally disruptive and embarrassing. When she experienced strong emotions, particularly positive ones like laughter or excitement, her muscles would suddenly become weak or completely paralyzed, causing her to collapse or drop whatever she was holding. These episodes were often mistaken for seizures, fainting, or attention-seeking behavior by people who didn't understand the neurological reality of her condition. The impact on Isabella's academic performance had been severe and demoralizing. Despite being intelligent and motivated, she had difficulty staying awake during classes, frequently fell asleep during tests and important presentations, and missed significant amounts of instruction due to sudden sleep attacks that could last for hours. Teachers who didn't understand her condition had initially interpreted her behavior as disrespectful, lazy, or indicative of problems at home, rather than recognizing it as a symptom of a medical disorder. The social consequences of Isabella's narcolepsy had been even more devastating than the academic challenges. Friends had become frustrated with her unpredictable sleep attacks during social activities, had stopped inviting her to events where falling asleep would be embarrassing or disruptive, and had begun to view her as unreliable or uninterested in maintaining friendships. The isolation that resulted from these misunderstandings had been profound and heartbreaking for someone who had previously been outgoing and socially active. The most painful aspect of Isabella's social experience had been the constant judgment and criticism from people who assumed that her sleep attacks were voluntary or could be controlled with better sleep hygiene, more willpower, or different lifestyle choices. Well-meaning adults had suggested that she simply needed to go to bed earlier, exercise more, or try harder to stay awake, not understanding that narcolepsy was a neurological condition that couldn't be overcome through behavioral changes alone. Isabella's family had struggled to understand and accommodate her condition while also advocating for appropriate support and understanding from schools, friends, and community members who were unfamiliar with narcolepsy. Her parents, Maria and Carlos Santos, had spent countless hours researching the condition, meeting with medical professionals, and educating teachers and administrators about Isabella's needs and limitations. The diagnosis process had been lengthy and frustrating, involving multiple sleep studies, neurological evaluations, and consultations with specialists before Isabella's symptoms were properly identified as narcolepsy with cataplexy. During this diagnostic period, Isabella had endured months of speculation about possible psychological causes, suggestions that she was depressed or anxious, and implications that her symptoms might be attention-seeking behavior rather than legitimate medical concerns. Even after receiving an official diagnosis and beginning treatment with medications designed to help regulate her sleep-wake cycles, Isabella had continued to experience significant symptoms that affected her daily functioning. The medications helped reduce the frequency and severity of her sleep attacks, but couldn't completely eliminate them, and they came with side effects that created additional challenges for managing her condition. The treatment regimen for narcolepsy had required Isabella to take stimulant medications to help maintain wakefulness during the day, and other medications to help regulate her nighttime sleep. These medications had improved her symptoms, but it also affected her appetite, mood, and energy levels in ways that required constant monitoring and adjustment by her medical team. The psychological impact of living with narcolepsy had been complex and ongoing. Isabella had developed anxiety about falling asleep in public or during important activities, had experienced depression related to the social isolation and academic difficulties caused by her condition, and had struggled with feelings of shame and embarrassment about having a disorder that many people didn't understand or take seriously. Isabella had also dealt with the challenge of managing a condition that was largely invisible to others. Unlike physical disabilities that people could see and understand, narcolepsy created disabilities that were hidden until symptoms occurred, making it difficult for others to recognize the ongoing challenges she faced and the constant effort required to manage her condition. The Family Feud application had been submitted by Carlos Santos, who had hoped that participating in an engaging, stimulating activity might help Isabel feel proud of her ability to function despite her neurological challenges. He had also hoped that appearing on television might provide an opportunity to raise awareness about narcolepsy and help others understand the reality of living with a sleep disorder. During the pre-show preparations, Isabella had been managing her symptoms carefully, taking her medication at prescribed times, and using caffeine strategically to help maintain alertness during the taping. The production team had been informed about her condition and had made accommodations to ensure that she could participate safely, including having medical personnel available if needed. The game had been proceeding with Isabella participating as actively as her condition allowed, but clearly struggling to maintain the consistent alertness and energy that the fast-paced environment required. The Santos family was competing against the Williams family from Texas, and while both sides had been playing enthusiastically, there was something obviously different about Isabella's energy levels and responsiveness compared to other contestants. But when it came time for the category Times When You're Completely Misunderstood, and it was Isabella's turn at the buzzer, the question had struck directly at the heart of her daily experience with narcolepsy and the constant judgment she faced from people who didn't understand her condition. Steve Harvey had approached the podium with his usual warm energy, but something about Isabella's obvious fatigue and the way she was struggling to maintain alertness had made him more gentle and attentive than usual. "All right, Isabella," Steve had said softly. "Times when you're completely misunderstood. What comes to mind?" Isabella had fought against a wave of drowsiness, focused her energy on staying alert, and responded with the frustrated honesty that comes from years of being judged for symptoms beyond her control. "When I fall asleep in the middle of class and everyone thinks I'm lazy or don't care," Isabella had said, her words carrying 3 years of frustration with medical misunderstanding. "But I have narcolepsy, and my brain can't control when I sleep. I could fall asleep right now, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." The studio had become very quiet as everyone present tried to understand what it would be like to live with the constant threat of losing consciousness at any moment, regardless of how important the situation might be. Steve had paused, clearly recognizing that this young woman was describing a serious medical condition that affected her ability to function in ways most people couldn't imagine. "Isabella," Steve had said gently, "help me understand what narcolepsy is and how it affects you." "It's a brain disorder that affects how I sleep and stay awake," Isabella had explained, grateful for the opportunity to educate others about her condition. "My brain can't regulate sleep like normal people's brains do. I can fall asleep anywhere, anytime, without warning. I also have something called cataplexy, which means my muscles can suddenly become weak when I feel strong emotions." The studio audience had listened with obvious attention and growing understanding as they learned about a condition that most had never heard of or understood. How has this affected your school and social life? Steve had asked with genuine concern. It's been really hard, Isabella had admitted. Teachers think I'm not paying attention or that I'm being disrespectful when I fall asleep. Friends get frustrated when I fall asleep during movies or conversations. People think I can control it, but I can't. Steve had looked at Maria and Carlos Santos, who were clearly emotional as they listened to their daughter describe the challenges she faced daily. Mr. and Mrs. Santos, Steve had said, how has this affected your family's understanding of neurological conditions? It's taught us that there are medical conditions that people can't see or understand, Maria had said. Isabella fights every day just to stay awake and participate in normal activities. She's not lazy, she's dealing with a brain that works differently than other people's brains. Carlos had nodded, his voice filled with pride and concern. She takes medication, follows a strict sleep schedule, and works harder than most people just to do things that come naturally to others, Carlos had said. We're proud of her strength and determination. Steve had looked at Isabella with obvious respect and understanding. Isabella, Steve had said, what you're dealing with is a real medical condition, and anyone who judges you for symptoms you can't control doesn't understand what they're talking about. You're not lazy, you're fighting a neurological battle every single day. Steve had begun removing his suit jacket, understanding that this moment required both validation of Isabella's struggle and recognition of her daily courage. Isabella, Steve had said, placing the jacket around her shoulders. This jacket represents something very important today. It represents the understanding that your brain works differently, not wrong. You're fighting to stay awake and engaged in a world that doesn't always understand your struggle, and that takes incredible strength. Isabella had pulled the jacket closer, clearly moved by the recognition and validation of her condition. Steve had turned to address the studio audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve had announced, Isabella Santos is teaching us something important about neurological conditions and the strength it takes to live with invisible disabilities. She's showing us that some battles are fought inside the brain, and that judging people for medical symptoms is never appropriate. The game had resumed with increased understanding and support from everyone present, as the audience and production team recognized the daily challenges that Isabella's seemingly normal appearance concealed. When Steve had asked the final question about things that take real strength, Isabella had answered, fighting to stay awake in a world that thinks sleepiness is a choice. The episode aired 3 months later and became an important educational tool for narcolepsy awareness and understanding of sleep disorders. Sleep medicine organizations used Isabella's story to help people understand the reality of narcolepsy and to encourage better support for students and workers dealing with sleep disorders. Isabella had kept Steve's jacket as a symbol of the moment when her invisible struggle was publicly recognized and validated. More importantly, her story had helped her school implement better accommodations for students with sleep disorders and had connected her with other young people dealing with similar challenges. The jacket represented her understanding that neurological differences are medical realities, not character flaws, that invisible disabilities deserve the same respect and accommodation as visible ones, and that educating others about misunderstood conditions is an important form of advocacy. Because that's what courage looks like when it fights to stay conscious in a world that assumes alertness is automatic. That's what strength sounds like when it advocates for understanding of invisible neurological conditions. And that's what happens when a 15-year-old girl teaches everyone around her that sleep disorders are medical conditions, not lifestyle choices, and that the brain's complexity creates challenges that deserve support rather than judgment. Isabella Santos had been living with the constant threat of falling asleep at inappropriate times, but on that day at Family Feud, she showed the world that narcolepsy is a serious neurological condition that requires understanding, accommodation, and respect, rather than judgment and criticism.